They did not look at her. No one invited her into the circle of conversation. No one poured her a glass of champagne. Kara Ellison's wheelchair stood still in the corner of the room like a forgotten piece of decoration at the most glamorous party Chicago had seen that year. Everyone in that million-dollar room knew each other's names except hers. But Mason Cole was different. He was the only man in that room not wearing an expensive suit, and the only one who sat down to meet her at eye level. That night, he discovered a secret the corporation had buried for 3 years. What Mason found inside Kara's bag was about to change everything, and the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. The Meridian Grand Hotel rose above Chicago's lakefront like a promise built in glass and steel, its upper floors burning against the November sky as though the building itself was performing for the city below. On the 14th floor inside Pinnacle Hall, 300 guests dressed in their finest had gathered for the Nexvara Group's annual charity gala, an event that raised money for financial literacy initiatives, and more usefully, raised the visibility of everyone who attended it. The room smelled of champagne and fresh lilies and something harder to name, that specific atmosphere of wealth performing itself in real time. Chandeliers cast everything in warm gold. Tables were draped in ivory linen and set with crystal that threw small rainbows across centerpieces no one would remember by morning. At the far end of the hall, a curved stage waited behind soft amber light, and a jazz quartet filled the air with music that was decorative rather than meant to be heard. Like the flowers, like the candles, like everything else in the room. Mason Cole stood near the rear service door with a radio in one hand and a seating chart in the other, wearing the gray uniform of the event logistics company that had contracted him for the evening. He was 29, and he did not belong to this room in any way the room would have recognized. But that was fine. He was there to make sure the microphones worked, the catering stations were stocked, and the evening ran without the kind of visible friction that people in rooms like this paid handsomely to avoid. He had been doing contract event work for 14 months, moving from venue to venue, since the network infrastructure company where he had spent 4 years restructured its technical division and let him go along with 11 others on a Tuesday in September. Before he walked into the hotel that evening, he had sat in his car for a moment and looked at a small photograph tucked into his wallet. A girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, 6 years old and entirely unimpressed by most of the world, and then he had put it away and gone inside. Charlotte Webb appeared at his elbow with a tablet and a slight frown, pointing out an adjustment to the east wall seating arrangement and running through the revised schedule for the award presentation. Charlotte had coordinated Nexvara's events for 3 consecutive years and moved through the room with the quiet authority of someone who knew where everything was and had fought to get it there. She was mid-sentence when the room shifted. It was not a sound or an announcement, just a collective reorientation, the way a room full of people who track power can sense its arrival before the door fully opens. Giselle Hartwell walked in wearing a cobalt blue dress that fell to the floor in a clean line, her chestnut hair arranged with a precision that appeared effortless and was anything but, and the room reorganized itself around her like water around a stone. She was 28 years old and had been chief executive officer of Nexvara Group for 2 years, and she carried that fact in every step she took. Beside her, 2 paces to the left, walked Jason Mercer, the company's chief financial officer, somewhere past 50, silver at his temples, wearing a smile that occupied the lower portion of his face without ever reaching his eyes. Charlotte said with genuine admiration that it was remarkable what Giselle had accomplished at her age. Mason did not respond. His eyes had moved to the far side of the room, where a staff member near the entrance had checked a guest list twice and was now directing a woman in a wheelchair toward table 14, in the corner, beside the door that led to the service kitchen. The woman moved without fanfare, without an escort, without the small social performances that the rest of the room was conducting as its primary activity. She wore a gray-white blouse, simple and clean, her dark hair threaded with silver and pulled back with the practicality of someone who had stopped making unnecessary decisions long ago. She did not scan the room the way people do when they are hoping to be seen. She found table 14 and settled there as though she had expected nothing different. The table was positioned against the wall at the maximum distance from the stage, close enough to the kitchen door that the sounds of clattering trays occasionally drifted through. Around her, the gala's social architecture proceeded without interruption. Groups formed at the bar, at the long tables near the windows, on the terrace where city lights spread out below. An older man in a charcoal suit passed close to table 14, glanced at the woman, and then looked away with the particular velocity of someone who has made a decision before their face can betray that they made one. A server moved through the room with a tray of champagne flutes and passed table 14 twice without stopping. Mason noticed this. He was standing near the rear beverage station, close enough to observe without being part of it, and he noticed the way she sat with her hands folded over the table edge and her glass of hot water still untouched from the start of the evening, because the table sat 6 inches too high for comfortable reach from the seat of a wheelchair. He noticed, and he said nothing yet, but he did not forget it. Giselle and Jason moved through the room as though conducting a survey of their holdings, pausing here, accepting congratulations there, redirecting conversations with the smooth efficiency of people who have done it many times. At one point near the east side of the room, a guest in a dark suit leaned toward Giselle and said something, nodding slightly in the direction of table 14. Mason was close enough to hear Giselle's answer. She glanced over her shoulder, a brief look, unhurried, the kind of look one gives something that requires very little consideration, and said that the woman was a minor shareholder and that the organizing committee had been polite enough to extend an invitation. Then she turned back to the conversation without looking in that direction again. Jason Mercer heard this, and the smile on the lower half of his face shifted by a fraction of a degree. Only Mason saw that, because he was the only person in the room not performing something of his own. He had not planned to stop. Charlotte had asked him to check the stage microphones before the presentation, and the direct route took him past the east side of the room, past table 14. He slowed as he passed. The woman's water glass was still full and still out of comfortable reach. The plate in front of her had barely been touched, not because the food was poor, but because reaching across that height with any consistency required effort she had apparently chosen not to spend on making herself look comfortable. Mason stopped. He was aware that stopping was not strictly within his job description for the evening, and he was aware that someone might be watching him deviate from the efficient path a logistics contractor is supposed to take through a room. He did it anyway. He found a low chair at the adjacent unused table, set it beside hers without asking, and sat down so that his eyes were level with her eyes. He moved her water glass 2 inches closer and said, without preamble, that the table was set too high for the clearance of her chair, and that he would let the staff know it needed adjusting. She looked at him, not with the warm softening that people sometimes show when they have been acknowledged after a long period of invisibility. She looked at him the way a person looks when they are deciding something, when they are measuring the distance between what is being presented and what is actually there. She said, simply, that she appreciated it. They exchanged a few sentences. She asked him what he did there. He said event logistics. She did not make the small social noise of approval that most people make to fill the silence after someone gives a modest answer. She simply nodded and said it was a well-organized evening. The precision of her observation, not a compliment but an assessment, stayed with him. It did not stay quiet for long. A staff coordinator appeared at Mason's shoulder within 2 minutes, speaking in the low register people use when they want to assert authority without causing a scene, informing him that contractors were not permitted to seat themselves with the guests during service hours. Mason stood without argument. Before he could respond at all, the woman at the table looked up at the coordinator and said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely unafraid, that the man had been correcting a seating arrangement that should have been addressed before the event began, and that if the staff had done their job properly, she would not have needed him to do it for them. The coordinator went a careful shade of red and withdrew. Mason looked at the woman once more, and she had already turned back to her glass, as if the exchange had cost her nothing, as if she was accustomed to deploying exactly the amount of force required and no more. The documents were not something Mason sought out. Midway through the evening, Charlotte asked him to carry a sealed folder from the operations suite on the floor above down to Jason Mercer, a routine administrative task. He took the service elevator, and on the way down the folder slipped from under his arm and hit the floor of the car, spilling several pages across the carpet. He collected them quickly, stacking them back into the folder without reading them. But his eyes caught a name on the top line of one page before he could stop them. It was a formal corporate document, dense with legal language, titled in a header that read like a board resolution. The word Ellison was there. The words co-founder and removal and effective date were there. The date was in March of 2021. He tucked the pages back into the folder, pressed the lobby button, and rode down to the ballroom level. He said nothing when he handed the folder to Mercer's assistant. He did not know yet what any of it fully meant. But the name on that document now had a face, and the face was at table 14, and something in the arrangement of those facts was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like a structure. Near midnight, during the break between dinner service and the awards presentation, Mason went to the secondary corridor off the ballroom's north side to run a final check on the extension cables for the stage setup. He found Kara Ellison there. She had moved out of the main room at some point without his noticing and was parked near the corridor window, which looked north across the city toward the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The water invisible at this hour but present in the quality of the air, in the faint shifting of the lights at the horizon, he slowed. She did not turn immediately. He said he was checking the cables and that he was not going to disturb her. She said he was not disturbing her. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, the kind that sometimes opens up between two people who have already said the most necessary things and are in no hurry to fill the space with less necessary ones. She asked him how long he had been doing event work. He told her the rough outline: 4 years in network infrastructure, 14 months of contract work since, the restructuring that had made one possible and the other necessary. She said that companies use the word restructuring when they do not want to say what is actually happening. He asked whether she had been with Nexvara for long. She looked at the window for a moment before answering. She said she had known the company from the beginning. The way she said it, not proudly, not bitterly, but with the flat precision of a fact being stated, told him it was a very different kind of knowing than attending the annual gala. He found Charlotte on his way back through the main hall and asked her carefully if she knew who the woman at table 14 was. Charlotte looked at him with the slight wariness of someone being asked to share information in a room where sharing information could be professionally inconvenient. Then she lowered her voice. She said that Kara Ellison had co-founded Nexvara with a man named Henry Greer back in 2014, that she had been present at every major technical decision the company made in its first 7 years, and that after a serious automobile accident in early 2021, she had spent months in surgical recovery. During that time, Charlotte said the board had held an emergency session. Jason Mercer had organized it. The vote to remove Kara from her co-founder role had passed 5-1. The notation beside her name in the official record read absent without cause. Charlotte had heard the story from a former Nexvara employee who no longer worked there for reasons that had never been clearly explained. Mason asked whether Kara still held any shares. Charlotte shrugged. Nobody talked about it openly, she said, but if she did, it would explain why Jason had arranged for her to sit beside the kitchen door tonight, rather than simply not invite her at all. It was the bag that changed everything, in the way that small things sometimes announce large ones. Mason had returned to the north corridor to collect the extension cables, and Kara was still near the window, but her posture had shifted. There was a tension in her shoulders, a focused effort directed downward at the small satchel attached to the side of her chair which had caught its strap on a decorative iron bracket along the lower wall. She was trying to work it loose without asking anyone for help, with the quiet persistence of a person who has learned to solve small problems alone so as not to give anyone a reason to offer the kind of help that comes with an expression. Mason set down the cable coil and moved to the bracket without being asked. The strap came free in a few seconds. And as it did, a small object fell from the outer pocket of the bag and landed on the floor between them, a black USB drive, no larger than a thumb, with a strip adhesive label along its side handwritten in small careful letters, NVR-IT 2021 Phenol. He picked it up. He held it out. She did not take it immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the measuring look from earlier, but with something that had moved past measuring into a decision already made. She asked quietly whether he knew of any meeting rooms on this floor that were still open. The secondary meeting room off the north corridor was unlocked because it served as an overflow staging area for event equipment, which meant Mason had a legitimate reason to have a key and no reason that anyone should question. He held the door. Kara moved inside and set her laptop on the table, produced from the larger bag beneath her chair, which she had been carrying all evening, had always been carrying, had planned for this exact sequence without knowing which specific person would be the one standing beside her when it happened. She inserted the drive. She did not preamble what she was about to say with apologies or extensive context. She said that in March of 2021, while she was in a hospital undergoing spinal surgery following her accident on the Kennedy Expressway, Jason Mercer had convened an emergency board meeting. He had circulated a proxy authorization document bearing her signature. That signature was fabricated. An independent forensic document analyst, and then a second one, and then a third, had confirmed this in writing. The vote to remove her from her co-founder position had passed on the strength of that fabricated authorization. Her actual vote, the one she would have cast had she been present or had her proxy not been falsified, would have been a no, a single no that under the original articles of incorporation carried sufficient weight to halt any motion affecting founder status. The audit files on the drive contained something additional. In the 6 weeks preceding the board meeting, 3 transfers had been processed from a Nexvara operating subsidiary through 2 intermediary entities to a third company whose registration led, through a sequence of addresses, to a firm with Jason Mercer's personal attorney listed as its registered agent. The total across those 3 transfers was $11.4 million. She still held 31% of outstanding Nexvara shares. Under the original founding articles, that was enough to exercise a strategic veto on any major corporate decision, a right that had been effectively suspended for 3 years by the fraudulent removal. She stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Mason sat across the small table and did not ask any of the questions that were forming, because he understood she had not brought him here to answer questions. He asked only one thing, not about the risk to himself. He asked what had happened to people like the ones who had been terminated during the period when Jason Mercer had been operating without a counterbalancing vote at the board level. She opened a second file on the laptop. There was a list of names, 41 names, with dates and roles and brief notations beside each one. Technical leads, compliance officers, a risk analyst, 2 members of an internal audit team, a senior infrastructure engineer who had flagged an anomaly in the subsidiary accounts in late 2021. And been released for performance reasons 6 days later. They were not Mason's colleagues, and none of their names were ones he recognized, but they were the kind of people he was, doing the kind of work he had done, and the pattern of how and when they had left the company was not random. She told him that Owen Reeves, the independent board counsel present in the gala room tonight at table 3 in a Navy suit, had been working with her for 8 months. Tonight was the night they had chosen to deliver the documentation in person, because the formal submission window under the company's articles required physical delivery of certified materials to the independent board counsel at an official company function, and this gala was the only qualifying event before the next scheduled board vote in January. She had come tonight knowing Jason would be watching her. She could not deliver the documents herself without that delivery being observed, intercepted, or later challenged as procedurally irregular. She needed a courier with no identifiable connection to her case, no motive that could be imputed, no role in the company's history. She needed someone who moved through the room without being seen as a player. She asked Mason whether he understood what she was asking him to do. He sat with it for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to be clear with himself about what he was deciding. If Jason Mercer discovered what he was carrying, Mason would lose the contract, would almost certainly be blacklisted from future event work through Nexvara's network of partner venues, and would face potential legal exposure from a company with enough retained counsel to make any exposure costly regardless of its merits. He was 29 years old and had a daughter and a 1-bedroom apartment and a car that needed new brake pads. He understood the calculation. He looked at the list of 41 names on the screen. He asked one question, not about the risk to himself. He asked whether the delivery, if completed, would be legally sufficient to trigger the review process that could eventually address those terminations. She told him it would initiate a mandatory audit review under state corporate law within 72 hours of delivery, and that the moment the documents were in Owen Reeves's hands, they were protected by the same privilege as a court filing. She said she was not asking him to do anything illegal, only something inconvenient and somewhat risky for a person in his position. Mason stood. He asked her for the printed documentation, 14 pages notarized, with a certification letter from the independent audit firm, and she produced it from the main bag. He slid the pages into his event logistics clipboard, the same one he had been carrying all night, the one that contained schedules and cabling diagrams and the kind of paperwork that nobody in a room like that ever looks at twice when it is in the hands of someone wearing a gray uniform. He went back in. The room was warmer now, denser with the particular heat of several hundred people who had been drinking expensive wine for 3 hours and were beginning to feel the loosening that precedes the part of an evening where the proceedings matter slightly less than the photographs. Mason moved from the north entrance toward the east side of the room at the pace he always moved. Unhurried, purposeful, a man with a specific task going to complete it. He stopped twice to adjust fixtures he did not need to adjust, because stopping was natural for him and it made his path through the room look entirely routine. Table 3 was near the front, which meant moving closer to the stage, closer to the area where Jason Mercer stood with 2 guests in a cluster near the curtain. Jason's eyes passed over Mason the same way everyone's eyes passed over Mason. He was part of the room's infrastructure, present and therefore invisible. At table 3, Owen Reeves was finishing a quiet conversation with the woman beside him. He was 60 or close to it, with the face of a man who had spent more time in courtrooms than in banquet halls, and whose social patience had been maintained through long professional practice rather than natural preference. Mason set the clipboard on the table edge and said, at a volume sufficient for Reeves and no one further, that the materials were from Kara Ellison and that she had said he would be expecting them. Owen Reeves looked at him for exactly the time it took to confirm that Mason's expression held no angle, no request, no expectation beyond the simple fact of delivery. Then his hand came down on the clipboard. He asked quietly where she was. Mason said she was in the secondary meeting room off the north corridor and that she would return to the hall shortly. Owen nodded once. Mason turned and had taken 4 steps when a hand came to rest on his shoulder with the kind of practiced casualness indistinguishable from friendliness unless you understand its context. Jason Mercer was beside him. The smile was in its usual position. The eyes were doing the actual work. He asked what Mason had just left at table 3. Mason looked at him with the particular blankness that a person who has been underestimated all evening is able to produce without any effort at all, and said it was the updated technical notes for the soundboard configuration during the award presentation. He said it in the tone of someone genuinely surprised that anyone would ask. Jason held the look for several seconds. He was calculating. On one side of the calculation was the possibility that this logistics contractor was exactly what he appeared to be. On the other was the possibility that something else was happening. The calculation landed where it usually does when someone wealthy and powerful looks at someone in a gray uniform holding a clipboard. It landed on the simpler explanation. Mercer told him to get back to his station. Mason nodded and walked toward the rear of the room, moving deliberately, not quickly, because quick would have been its own answer. The awards program began 12 minutes later. Giselle Hartwell took the stage to a reception that was generous and practiced, the sound of 300 people who know the appropriate volume for applause at an event of this kind. She spoke about the company's growth, about innovation, about the responsibility that success creates. Behind her, a screen displayed a curated visual history of Nexvara Group, the early years, the first product launch, the expansion into new markets, the philanthropic initiatives of recent years. The footage was polished and the chronology was selective, as corporate histories always are. And then, in the section covering the founding year, there appeared a photograph. 2 people standing at a product launch event, early versions of the company's interface displayed on screens behind them. The photograph had been cropped, visible in the slight compositional imbalance, the way one side of the frame was tighter than the other, as though a third presence had been removed. One of the 2 visible people was a man recognizable to the room as a younger Henry Greer, the company's nominal founder. The other side of the image was cut just at the edge, leaving only the suggestion of a shoulder, a sleeve. At table 14, in the corner by the kitchen door, Kara Ellison watched the screen. Her expression did not change. Her hands rested in her lap, but her right hand closed, slowly and without drama, around the wheel of her chair. Owen Reeves stood up. He did not wait for a pause in the program or raise his hand or do any of the things that people do when they want permission to speak. He simply stood at table 3 in his navy suit, and his voice carried the way a voice carries when it has been trained to be heard in rooms that are not necessarily interested in hearing it. He said that under Section 14.3 of the Nexvara Group Corporate Charter, as the independent board counsel present at an official company function, he had an obligation to notify the assembled board members, shareholders, and company officers that he had just received certified documentary evidence of a material breach of fiduciary duty connected to a board resolution dated the 14th of March, 2021. The room did not go silent immediately. It went through a stage where individual conversations stopped, and people looked at each other to confirm that what they were hearing was what they were hearing. Then it was silent. Giselle Hartwell stood at the podium and did not speak. The jazz quartet sat with instruments at rest at the side of the stage and did not move either. Jason Mercer pushed back from his table and said, in a voice calibrated to project authority rather than volume, that this was a coordinated attack and that whatever documents were being referenced had been obtained improperly and would be contested. Owen Reeves did not look at him. He continued in the same measured register, stating that 3 independent forensic analysts had examined a proxy authorization bearing the signature of co-founder Kara J. Ellison submitted in connection with the March 2021 board vote, and had certified unanimously that the signature was not authentic. He said the board resolution passed on the basis of that authorization was therefore legally void from the date of its passage. He said that Kara Ellison retained her full co-founder status, her voting rights under the founding articles, and her right to seek remediation for all decisions made in the 3-year interim. He set the documents on the table in front of him and sat down. The door on the north side of the hall opened. It was not a dramatic entrance. She did not time it for effect, or she had timed it so precisely for effect that the precision itself had become invisible. Kara Ellison moved down the central aisle between the tables, her chair making no sound on the carpeted floor, her posture upright, her expression the same one she had worn all evening, clear, contained, present. She stopped when she reached the open center of the room, in the space where people could see her from every direction. She looked toward the stage. Giselle Hartwell was still standing behind the podium, holding the microphone she had stopped using. The room watched Kara the way it had conspicuously not watched her for the first 3 hours of the evening. She did not need the microphone Giselle was holding. The room was quiet enough. She said that 3 years ago, the people in that room had voted to remove her while she was on an operating table. She said they had placed her at table 14 that evening, beside the kitchen door. She said she had not come tonight to reclaim a seat at any table. She had come to place the correct name on what had happened. She said this without theater, without a raised voice, without the trembling quality that people sometimes use to signal that a thing they are saying is important. She did not need to signal it. It was already in the room. Jason Mercer moved toward the aisle. He had the quality in that moment of a man who is not yet certain the exits have been covered and is beginning the early stage of an assessment. They had been covered. 2 men in suits whom Owen Reeves had quietly positioned near the north and east exits stepped forward, not to restrain him but to hand him an envelope. The envelope contained a formal notification from the State Financial Oversight Authority that a supplementary audit examination had been opened the previous afternoon, referencing the same documentation now in Owen Reeves's possession. Jason Mercer looked at the envelope, then at Kara, then at a point in the middle distance that contained nothing useful, and then he sat down. Giselle Hartwell descended from the stage, not hurriedly, not in retreat, but with the deliberate pace of someone recalibrating in real time. She walked toward Kara and stopped a few feet in front of her. Most of the room could not hear what she said next. Mason, standing near the north wall, was close enough. Giselle said she had not known about the proxy. She said it with the directness of someone who understood the statement would be tested and wanted it stated clearly before it needed to be. Kara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said she believed her. She said she knew who was responsible. She said Giselle's accountability was a separate question from Jason's, a question the months ahead would work through in proper detail. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and Kara was not offering it as such. It was a precise distinction, made clearly, the way she made everything. In the weeks that followed, the structure of what had happened became visible in the way that structures do after the surface is removed. Jason Mercer was formally charged on counts of document fraud and breach of fiduciary trust by the state attorney's office. Giselle Hartwell, following a preliminary investigation by the oversight authority that found no evidence of her prior knowledge of the fabricated authorization, announced that she would step back from executive duties voluntarily during the period of review, a decision she made before anyone asked her to, which was noted in the coverage that followed. The full board of Nexvara Group convened an extraordinary session. Kara Ellison's co-founder status was formally reinstated, her voting rights restored in full retroactive to the original date of the fraudulent removal. She did not ask for the chief executive's position. She asked for the formation of an independent ethics oversight committee and for the complete publication of all internal audit records from 2018 through 2021 on the company's regulatory filing page. Both requests were approved. 41 personnel files were reopened for review. Charlotte sent Mason a message 3 days after the gala with a link to a news article and a single line asking whether he had seen the front page. He had. The evening before he received the call from Owen Reeves's office, Mason sat at the small table in his apartment and thought about Kara at table 14. Not about the documents or the legal proceedings now in motion. He thought about the specific quality of her stillness in that corner of the room, the 3 hours she had spent sitting there holding everything she was carrying without putting any of it on her face. He thought about all the people in Pinnacle Hall who had moved their eyes past her and toward things they found more legible. Toward power they could recognize immediately. Toward status they already knew how to read. He thought about what they had missed and what it had cost the 41 people on that list, and what it continued to cost everyone who sits at a corner table while the room decides they are not worth the trouble of a second look. Owen Reeves called on Monday morning as Kara had said he would, and offered Mason a position overseeing network and systems infrastructure for a newly established office. The offer was not framed as a reward, which was the precise quality of it that made Mason certain he would take it. It was framed as a need, a specific technical need that required a specific kind of person. Kara had described the kind of person required. He was told he had already demonstrated both qualifications. He stood at the window of the small office where he had come for the interview and looked out at the gray November sky over Chicago. The same sky, the same city, a different vantage. He thought about what he would say if someone asked him to describe what he had done on the night of the Nextvara Gala. He thought about it for a moment, and then he thought he knew. He had only sat down beside a table that was set too high, for a woman the room had decided not to see. It turned out that was the only thing the night had needed someone to do.